Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, because we know that with all of our Infrastructure Intelligence live events, we do tend to get a international audience. You're very welcome to this latest event organised in the Infrastructure Intelligence live series in association with our strategic partners, BECG. And I think we've got quite an interesting event coming up today, which will be looking at the future of cities in a post-COVID world. Let's hope we get to that post-COVID world very quickly, because it seems like it's been taking quite a long time to actually get there. Hundreds of you have actually registered for today's event, so I would hope that we'd have a really good webinar, really good discussion. As always, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, then please post them in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible when we get to the discussion part of our proceedings. And I think the future of cities, and indeed the future of towns and villages as well, is obviously quite an important issue, particularly when we consider what we've actually been through in the recent period. I think it's fair to say that in a number of months over the last year, the pandemic has dramatically changed, certainly city life. Many of us, including most of us, I would imagine, who are on this event today, have quickly shifted to working from home. Cities have become almost ghost towns in some cases. And, you know, people have started to do things in a different way. The character of city life, if you like, has changed almost overnight. Obviously, that won't be a permanent shift, or will it? I mean, we'll find out about that when we listen to our speakers in a minute, and it'll be fascinating to hear from the experts that we've got around the table, who will all bring a different perspective, I'm sure, to what the future of cities might look like. And our panel today includes Stephen O'Malley, who's the founding director of Civic Engineers, Julia Thompson, the Smart Cities lead at the Greater London Authority. We've got Andrew Jones, who's a cities program leader from the consultancy ACOM. We've got Association for Consultancy and Engineering Chief Executive Hannah Vickers. We've got CK Delta Managing Director Jeff Mcgrath, and BECG's Infrastructure and Energy Director, Jamie Gordon. Our first speaker, though, is Stephen O'Malley, who is the founding director of the company Civic Engineers. And Civic Engineers, for those that aren't aware of their work, have significant expertise in the design and delivery of high quality buildings, structures, and public spaces. And Stephen has a particular passion, I know, and a belief in the key importance, the critical importance, in fact, of place, working with the prevailing geography of a place, and planning, design, and delivery of major public realm projects. And I'm sure Stephen's insights will be very, very interesting on this topic of the future of cities. So, Stephen, the floor's yours.
Good morning. Thanks, Andy. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and speak today on this this really hot topic. I think you've touched on a couple of the really profound changes that our society is grappling with over the course of the pandemic, some of which the pandemic has acted as a catalyst for change that was already in train. And I don't think that's a bad thing in some regard. I think with regards to the previous normal, it certainly had its shortcomings when it came to public health, the impact on the environment, and generally the way we ordered and led our lives. And I think what's been really encouraging over the last 12 months is how the debate with regards to climate change has moved from one of needing to advocate for climate change in actually to how do we actually deal with the climate change issue. And I think that's been a really, really important paradigm shift, not least of which has been copper fastened perhaps by the change in the White House and the arrival of Biden to re-energize this agenda and to prioritize climate responsibility with his re-engagement with COP26, for example, that's going to occur in Glasgow in November later this year, which I think is fantastic. With regards to some of those other patterns that we've seen forced upon us as a result of COVID, you know, it's remarkable that events like this are all now online on Zoom, and obviously we all miss the social interaction that we have in a personal sense outwith of the Zoom environment. And I'm sure Zoom fatigue has hit many of us, but nevertheless, there are aspects to virtual conferencing and virtual meetings that does open up a significant amount of benefits. There's the carbon agenda dimension to this whole reduced distances and reduced traveling aspect, which is very, very important. But I also think that actually it's also quite democratic. I appreciate that there is digital distinction in different neighborhoods and access to digital infrastructure, hardware, computers, good quality Wi-Fi and internet access is not even for everyone. So I'm not ignoring that aspect. But the other side of this is actually being able to contribute to the workforce through the internet has opened up the opportunity for job and become economically active for many who didn't have that option, whether you may have had a physical impediment in some form that may have limited your ability to move, or whether the demands and responsibilities that you may have had at home as a carer or other factors actually opens up the possibility to contribute to the workforce for many who didn't have that option before. I think on the point with regards to shorter distances, we've all been exploring our own postcodes in finite forensic detail over the course of the last 12 months. And I'm sure there's a balance that where the pendulum will swing back to a certain extent on that score, but hopefully not too far. And I do think that reinvesting in our immediate neighborhoods and picking up on the principles of compact neighborhoods, 20-minute neighborhoods, 15-minute neighborhoods, whatever metric you want to take, whether that's Paris or Melbourne or wherever it may be, there are distinct, significant advantages to thinking about our spatial configurations of our neighborhoods and towns in a way that allows us to access all of these services and amenities by traveling shorter distances. And that has significant benefits in terms of our own mental health and well-being, but again, also on the planet, and not having to make those hour each way journeys to get to an arbitrary point in space to contribute to whatever that might be in terms of the workday. I think the other really fascinating and game-changing event of the last 12 months has also been the high street. How retail repositions itself. We've seen ASOS and Boohoo and others come in and sweep up long-established high street brands. What does that mean for the built environment? What does that mean for our high streets? And if you look at that in combination and in concert with this shift in where people are now spending more of their time, there is a real opportunity here to think of our town centres in a much more experiential fashion and a cultural fashion, and how they may offer something that allows those communities to converge, to commune, and to contribute in those spaces, and the value that can provide those communities and society more broadly, and generate revenue, generate income, new business models for those spaces and for those buildings, which kind of leads on to the whole idea of repurposed buildings. You know, we've got a building stock that has been designed in many respects for a set purpose, and I think reimagining how those buildings can be repurposed, reemployed, adapted, without having to knock them down and start from scratch. What we want to do is keep the character of those buildings, but bring them back into use as something that is forward-facing in terms of what it could contribute to our society. Well, actually, a last point that I may just leave you with is with that reallocation of space, particularly in terms of highways. When we've got this finite amount of space between buildings in our urban centres, in reapportioning space away from private vehicles and opening up the opportunity for better walking, cycling infrastructure, it also presents the opportunity and space to incorporate green infrastructure in a meaningful way. And these are networks of biodiversity and surface water management that we can now properly embrace in our towns and city districts, and hardwire them into our town and city landscapes. And what I would contend as an engineer in this conversation is, yes, engineers have been responsible for some of this bad stuff, have been and have been quite rightly castigated for leading the conversations and pursuing perhaps a wrong-headed agenda. But actually, I think what we're looking at now is technical excellence from our engineers, absolutely, but interfacing that with a much higher degree of emotional intelligence in how we consider the experiential impacts of the decisions and ideas that we promote as an engineering discipline. I'll leave you there, if I may, for the moment, Andy, if that's okay.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Stephen. Really interesting to hear a first mention there for the concept of compact neighborhoods. That we've heard a lot, haven't we, about the 15 and 20-minute neighborhoods, and it'll be interesting to see, maybe what others, think about that concept as well. And also, it was really good to hear you talk about the role of engineers in all of this as well, because, while in the past, maybe the profession and indeed the industry has actually has taken some flack for what it's done, there's absolutely no question that going forward, it will be engineers and the construction sector will be turned to increasingly by opinion formers, decision makers, governments around the world to actually sort out these challenges and enable us to use that phrase, build back better, as we come out of the COVID situation. So for now, thanks for that. I'm sure we'll hear more from you during the discussion and the conversation later. Our next speaker is Julia Thompson, and Julia is the Smart Cities Policy Lead for the Greater London Authority, which I guess must be quite a significant challenge at the moment, at any time, given the fact that London is obviously one of the most important and largest metropolises in the Western world, but especially given the challenges that we've had through the pandemic. Julia oversees the Mayor's Smarter London Together roadmap, and she also advises the Chief Digital Officer at the GLA in using data and technology to meet the needs of Londoners. So I'm really looking forward to what Julia has to say on this particular issue. Julia, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me along. So when I was thinking about this topic this week, I was reflecting on I think I'm not quite in the business of future forecasting. I think my role is more setting the parameters so that people who are delivering like technology and digital solutions, they can do that in the right way. But I was thinking about there's a couple of things that I think the pandemic has really shown a need for, or shown like the usefulness of. And so the first one is, I think the pandemic has really forced many layers of government, particularly like London is a very complicated city. We've got 33 local authorities that are all essentially mini cities. So the need for relationships and collaborative working across those many layers of government so that we can address the challenge together. And a lot of that, I guess from my perspective, a lot of that is the ability to share data between different organisations so that we can get a fuller picture of what's happening in the city. The second thing is the pandemic affected people in many different ways. It wasn't the same experience for all Londoners. So it was really important for us at the GLA to look at the problem from many different ways. So we've done that with a couple of different examples. So we've used our Talk London platform to talk directly to Londoners. We've got an audience of about 60,000 on there. When we developed our missions, we've been engaging directly with the voluntary and community sector to get their voice, and we have a weekly survey with them that tells us sort of what's top of mind for their particular audience. We've gone the more traditional route of looking at Mastercard spend and mobility data to understand how people are moving and around our city. And I think that has that's really highlighted to me that we need to be okay with complexity, and that we can't boil down this problem to like one single set of statistics and one solution, because it's a sort of a variety of impacts across London. I think the third thing is sort of a bit more concrete, I guess, like the need for public infrastructure. That was really apparent at the start of the lockdown. Like just something simple like the access to public toilets in public spaces. That was such an issue in the first lockdown. I'm expecting it to be more of an issue now that people are able to be emerging a little bit more and socializing outside without having restaurants and bars open yet. And then related to that is like this street space and encouraging active travel. So how do we negotiate the expansion of footpaths or the putting in cycle lanes? It's a bit of a tricky one to negotiate. And I think the fourth thing is the importance of connectivity, which Stephen touched upon. With everyone, well, not everyone, with a lot of people working from home, you needed a really reliable internet connection. But not only that, just the access to devices. And I think that we've really seen that in London when people are at home, and then also having to have devices for their children as well to do homeschooling, and just making sure now that we're all of a sudden in a sort of digital world, we need to make sure that everyone has equal access to that. So that's something that we're really focused on. There's a couple of things I don't know yet, and I'm interested in finding out about. I'm quite interested, there's been a lot of speculation about overall population change, and there's been some reports saying that London's population will decline. I'm a bit skeptical of that, but I do think that maybe the demographics will change. I wonder about people with families perhaps moving out of the city, and so that will affect things like the delivery of long-term infrastructure like schools and healthcare and things like that. So I'm interested to see what will happen. I'm not willing to put any bets on it. And then the other thing that I'm quite focused on is the future of our high streets and the central activity zone and what will happen then. We've been doing some really interesting work looking at spend and mobility data across the city, and we've been able to sort of track we've been calling it the busyness of our high streets. And it's been quite interesting to see there's a very distinct ring of home workers in zone 2 and 3 in London. And there's also some high streets and town centres that have seen a much higher increase in spend than an average year. So we've been able to compare it to 2019. But interesting to see if that continues and how we can support all high streets and town centres following the pandemic. I guess lastly, I just mentioned that the GLA is still sort of in the midst of lots of the response to the lockdown and the pandemic, but we have got our recovery plans. We've got 9 missions which sort of focus on the key issues relating to London. So I'd encourage people to have a look at those, and we're taking a very collaborative approach on those, they're being developed in association with London councils and London boroughs. So bringing back to that, I guess my first point about relationships and working together. And I think that's been the one actual benefit of the pandemic, is I think it's really brought people from many different policy areas. It's broken down lots of silos and lots of organisational silos as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much. The point you finished on there in relation to working together and different stakeholders coming together as well. Because I think that is definitely, you couldn't fail to see that across all aspects of life. But I think we've also seen it in our industry as well. At least I hope we've seen it in our industry. And I think that's been a real positive as far as that's concerned. And also your other point about being okay with complexity, because, you know, when you start asking people for their opinion or you start collecting data, you don't always get, you know, a sort of a uniform view. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, here's a solution. But if the last sort of years taught us anything, is that there isn't one solution to anything. And I think, you know, that being comfortable with that, I suppose, uncertainty, you called it complexity, I think is really, really important and something that we need to grasp going forward. Perhaps it might make us a little bit less uptight in our daily work and, you know, what we do. Who knows? You know, that's webinar probably at some point, although I'm sure we've got some amateur psychologists on our panel today, but more of that a little bit later. Our next speaker is Andrew Jones, who's the Cities Programme Leader for ACOM. He leads the company's cities programmes across the world, the UK, Europe, Middle East and Africa. And he is involved in working with AECOM and for AECOM, connecting urban growth to infrastructure investment, master planning new places to live and work. And AECOM have been doing some fantastic work around the world, delivering solutions to some of society's most complex urban challenges. They don't just do the engineering, they don't just do that side of the work. They look a bit deeper. They have a deep dive into some of the issues that are really facing people in those areas. And I think that, you know, brings some real value to what they do as well. He also had an intimate involvement in the Olympic Park project, the regeneration project there, and also post-games legacy for East London as well. So I think we've got someone here who will definitely be able to tell us probably in some detail and certainly very interestingly about what he thinks the future of cities is going to look like as we move forward. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I think the two things that I just draw immediately out of that, and coming from what also Stephen and Julia have been saying, is that but perhaps is that you were saying about solutions. Those solutions, we don't know what the solutions are, but we need to, yet. And those who say they do are going to be wrong. But we need to be flexible and agile and put the right conditions in place so that we recover and build the economy in a positive way that is probably more balanced and equitable than it has been to date. So with that sort of that element, with also that experience, that wide experience that you talked about, that we're involved in, that every place is different and placemaking isn't a singular thing, and how cities will recover need to respond to the places that they are. So I think some of the messages that I got today are probably quite general, but they are the themes that I think we're going to need to address. You challenged with what the future holds for cities. Will they be the same again? Is the city we've known a thing of the past, or when we get back to normal? I think the only things that we actually do know is that our digital networks worked enough for us, many people to work at home, many city people to work at home. And the other point is that employers now trust staff to be productive, and presenteeism isn't necessarily as influential as it was. The other thing that we probably learned is that our city infrastructure and economy is not as resilient as it needs to be to weather global shocks like this that we're not planning for. So I think that it's the unknown unknowns that are the issue. We need to be more prepared than we have been. I think I'd add. I was saying that sort of 6 to 9 months ago on similar things. I think the other bit that we've probably now learned is that craving social interaction with colleagues, innovation, thriving with collaboration, that I'm sure we're all feeling is key. Means that actually there will be a return to the city. And that cities will thrive. And what the sort of the agglomeration and excitement of a city will return. That it has done for 3,000 years. It will do tomorrow. So I think that's the sort of the underlying piece in my thinking. But it is going to require people to be more confident with public transit and being close to people, and that will take time. Will they be the same again? No. I think the lasting effects of a pandemic will endure, and there will be a memory in the history of cities, like there is with everything that places have been through over the centuries. Earlier public health challenges and disease changed housing regulations so that all homes had fresh air circulating. Public intervention providing clean water supplies, city sewerage systems, or the Garden City movement, all came out of the Victorian mess that was the cities that created Stephen's lovely office base in Manchester, but the city was a pretty rough place to be in, and it was the health and housing and planning and infrastructure legislation that went behind that changed that. We'll see a bit of that in the future as well. So, and the other point is that will it return to normality? Well, it will, but what is normality going to be different, if that makes sense? And do we want our cities to return to the old normal? I think the shock imposed on city centres, particularly by the pandemic, and those ripple effects that you were alluding to, Andy, and Julia talked about, that actually the chances of resetting back to February 2020 are zero. And it's the challenge is to plan carefully for that recovery, and it must be that place-based response that I was referring to. Arguably, London, for one, was struggling with the pressures of growth, an overheating centre, unbalanced growth with the benefits not shared by all, affordable housing, economic opportunity, air quality, etc. All issues that the mayor is tackling. But actually, we've got the chance of doing something about those now, rather than just return to what we were doing before. So I think that we need to respond to the new economic and social realities that we've got. So what are the things we do need to consider? So across the UK, I think the very live is the response to the government's levelling up agenda. And there's not a comprehensive strategy for this, but certainly from the work that we're doing now, that it's coming through very clearly in the work we're doing for government clients. Major city centres will recover with their blend of high quality office product, the range of culture and hospitality, but the second tier of cities is where the focus needs to be. And the ability to work digitally as well, and the realisation that it actually does work, may well open up new potential for places that had lost their economic roles when we were relying on travelling physically between places. For London, also the response needs to be one of partnership with other UK cities, demonstrating that levelling up does not mean a levelling down for the capital and the wider southeast, and also to address some of the profound levelling up challenges in the capital. For me, as also the second area of enduring change is the renewed strength of local that I think both Julia and Stephen have talked about. And some of those suburbs and towns that have received a fillip in their economies with far more time spent there. On the flip side, we've got a whole series of medium-sized towns that are going to be devastated with the collapse of Arcadia and Debenhams, etc. So actually, there's a lot of thinking needs to go into this, and those previously focused on commuting are now taking ownership in the future of their own town centre as a civic hub for their community. And actually, I think that is going to stimulate a significant change, and a new model of town centre is going to come through. So I think there's something there, and that flexible working will endure. Particularly now that employers are focused on staff well-being agendas and giving people the freedom to grow, etc. I don't think we are going to return to 5 days a week in the office, and that where everybody is travelling in the peak hour, and there'll be more flexibility about that. We don't yet know the pattern of how we work, but there are clear trends coming from the commercial and workspace clients that we're working with. It is working environments based on collaboration and not rows of desks. And we'll go back to that point around innovation and team building and mentoring all needs face-to-face engagement. So the office will return, but I think that corporate occupiers may well focus on that good quality, high performance spec space, but take less floor space than previously. And does that open up the centre of our cities for new entrants who could not afford city locations in the past? Those new pioneers are likely to focus on refurbishment of existing stock to get that foothold in the city centre, and also the conversion to residential uses may well cut in that place. But that's also important if we want to decarbonise the built environment and promote a circular economy, that we do maximise the new normal as being refurbishment rather than just rebuild. I think the final 2 points that I'd just like to draw out around travel. If we are working in different places at different times of the day, then that's got to lead to a far more flexible transport network that is agile to different systems, and perhaps we don't have a peak. I think that that's a real challenge for transport planners, but particularly how we sustainably fund our transit systems in the long term. And the final dimension that I think all the speakers have or will touch on is the drive to net zero. It really hasn't gone away. and we've been preoccupied by public health, but this really does need to be the foundation stone of how we build back. So I think there's lots of elements here and the catalyst for that change and new cities is really exciting. Actually, we've just got to keep a laser lens on how we do it.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that. And interesting to hear you talk about how big and I suppose cataclysmic events in the past, actually maybe that's too strong a term, but how they've actually influenced the way we live. Whether that be through housing and the developments there. Obviously, transport is something that's been massively affected by urbanisation and other trends that we've seen as well. It's interesting seeing some of the stuff in the chat around. Is this like a new revolution? I mean, people talk about the third industrial revolution. But is this a different type of revolution that's actually going to basically have an impact on the way that everybody works and lives going forward? And will we look back, in many years' time and think, oh, that was the big COVID, sort of effect and what happened there? Also in the chat, I feel duty bound to mention that a couple of people are bigging up the fact that there are other cities other than London, which is true. As a northerner, I would totally concur with that, and I'm sure that the other cities will actually get a hearing during the course of the event, because obviously there's some fantastic work going on all over the country, as obviously there is in London as well. But we've got some great cities around the place, and not all of them are in the north either. Just before I'm accused of any northern bias. But yeah, some really good points there as well, and encouraging to hear your thoughts, Andrew, about the excitement of the city will actually return, even though we might be not working 5 days a week in an office. So I think that was, good to hear for those of us, and I'm sure it's almost everybody, who are just dying to get back to some kind of face-to-face, sort of engagement with other people, really. So thanks for that, and look forward to the discussion. Our next speaker is the Chief Executive of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, Hannah Vickers. ACE, for those that aren't aware, is the business association for engineering and consultancy firms, many of whom are intimately involved, like AECOM and others, in shaping the way our city and townscapes actually look, and will be playing a key role as the country looks to build back better in the future. Hannah has wide experience of working in the government sector, as well as with engineers and consultants and construction, and has been involved quite closely with the Treasury's work around infrastructure in the past. And I think we'll be able to hopefully add some insights into whether or not what we've just been through will actually be, a big lever to actually get government to work differently. And is there a recognition, maybe amongst government and the industry as a whole, that we do have to do things differently going forward? But anyway, that's me presupposing what Hannah's going to say. She's more than capable of doing that herself. Hannah.
Thank you very much, Andy. And yes, just to advertise other cities, I come from Sheffield, and it's an excellent city. So I was going to cover probably three aspects. I was going to sort of take stock, as you say, my background in terms of government policy advice, just to reflect on what I think the drivers are behind the change we're currently in. And then I was going to spend a bit of time looking at what that might do to the market. So for those of you who are listening from businesses, I shall try to and endeavour to sort of give some insights around what your role might be in shaping and developing the future cities. So that was the two aspects of what I was going to touch on. So the first one is a bit of a reflection on the type of change that we are still experiencing and will do for some time. We're not going to be post-COVID. We might be post the health impacts of COVID, but actually we're going to have a sort of fundamental challenge around the financial impacts and actually the social impacts. So unlike the financial crisis, where it was a period that I was in government following, you had relatively straightforward appreciation and understanding of what you were trying to get back to, because you were dealing with one crisis. What we've actually got here is a sort of collision of a number And within that, or at the centre of that, is people and society, and how that is going to change, which is the big unknown and the big question. Because, you know, as a government, you can, and the economists will tell you, you definitely can, to some extent, predict and manage, and you know the levers to intervene in a financial crisis. What is far more complex and just completely unknown is how society is going to change. And I think that's where a lot of the other panelists have touched on that. But it's important to kind of recognise that coming out of this, it's not going to be a straightforward recovery. We have a big unknown factor. Certainly anyone who has children will know that it's, you know, been challenging managing them socially. That's basically what the government is dealing with on a sort of multiple levels when we're having to deal with people's behaviour. So I think it'll be interesting. What we will say is, you know, certainly from government side, from industry side, it's not going to get it all right. So there's going to have to be quite a lot of one step forward, two steps back, change direction kind of approach around this, because there have to be quite a lot of being brave to put things out and then seeing how people respond and how people react to them. Even with the best behavioural insights teams in the centre of government, we're not going to be able to sort of say we will do this and the public will react in that way. So there's going to be quite a lot of shifting, policy changing, and that will come, you know, government will need to be quite flexible in its approach, but I think industry, and particularly looking to the businesses that I represent with the consultants and the contracting firms, they're going to have to be quite comfortable with uncertainty and with shifting patterns and changing priorities. Actually, you know, for economic recovery, we've been pushing for a sort of stable pipeline. Now there is some element of that the government will be able to commit to, and the private sector will be able to commit to in terms of investors, but it's certainly far from within their grasp to confidently say that. So that will be just, you know, we're just going to have to kind of get to grips with that and get to grips with how we manage the businesses around it. So looking more specifically at what the businesses themselves, I think, can do, what their role is, what I would be focusing on if I was running a business at the moment. So if I was a developer in a consultancy firm, I think the opportunity really is to how do you pivot your capability to build investor confidence? Because that's the challenge that we're going to have. So we're going to need to develop deeper insights, drawing on data to be able to do that, because it's going to be a lot more in real time. This behavioural, social side of the recovery is going to be something that we aren't going to be able to put into a sort of long-term transport model, as we have done perhaps when we've appraised schemes previously. We're going to have to be actually looking and testing and seeing what is going on in real time and feeding that back into investment appraisal and to the plans. So that's quite a challenge. I think it's an interesting challenge for the consultants and the developers, and I think we've certainly got the intellectual capability. Something I wanted to touch on was systems thinking, which is a buzzword at the moment. I'm seeing so much of this, and it annoys me a bit, to be honest, because I think what it is a buzzword for a really complex, tricky, interdependent problem. And I do feel that what we are dealing with, it definitely falls into that category, as does things like sort of mitigating, you know, net zero and moving to net zero by 2050. That is a system level challenge. And we talk as an industry a lot about system thinking, which just makes us sound like we're going to sit in a cupboard and think big thoughts, and, you know, be able to explore and sort of wallow, if you like, and indulge ourselves in understanding this system complexity, when actually what we need to be doing, I think, as an industry, is getting in there, understanding it, but then being able to kind of pop out the other side and articulate what interventions you need to make on the system in order to move things forward. And I think, you know, I would advocate, so I'm going to start it, I call it system doing, that we move beyond that kind of that sort of self-fulfilling, we're very clever doing system thinking, and say, actually, how do we turn that into practical advice, whether that's to policymakers or to investors, to actually give them some confidence to invest, because that's the challenge we'll be facing. If we sit and this is really hard, this is really complicated, we can think clever thoughts about it, we need to be able to really interrogate that, understand it, and then distill that down. In a sort of one of the roles that I have, I sit on the Construction Leadership Council, and that's definitely something we've been grappling with around net zero, trying to take what are very practical businesses and give them specific actions that they can take around net zero, avoiding getting caught up in that system, thinking complexity of, you know, you do this and then something happens over there, and it's really, really complex, but it's entirely possible. So I think, to my mind, that's the challenge I would level at our sort of developers and our consultants, is you need to kind of unravel that and be able to kind of come out of it with some really sort of tangible actions that interface with the system, but actually mean that you're not going to spend the next 10, 15 years thinking about what you want to do, but do something which is a sort of no regrets action off the back of it. So then moving to the contracting side, this has been touched on a little bit already by Stephen, but the repurposing market is going to be something which will grow, I think, significantly. So that will, you know, probably mean the rise of sort of small and medium projects, retrofitting, that sort of thing. You know, there are multiple drivers to that, not least the sort of changing social dynamics, but also the types of investments that we need to meet net zero are all around tweaking and fiddling with the existing system, the existing housing stock, the existing infrastructure system. So I think the repurposing, if I was in contracting, I think, you know, the sort of the days of new major infrastructure projects and major infrastructure investments are probably on hold. Certainly there's nothing that could be brought to market in the next 5 to 10 years that we don't already know about. So I would be shifting my business to be looking at some of those smaller and medium-sized projects. And then I've got a category of industry stuff that is, I think, as yet undetermined around who will deliver it. So it's kind of some of the more interesting forward-thinking things that we haven't, I don't think, got a clear forerunner in. And I think some of that is around what I'm calling the kind of non-construction solutions. So, you know, recognizing that we're going to have these changing social dynamics, there could be all sorts of really interesting solutions to some of our transport, our built environment challenges that are more around influencing people's behaviors, more around actually, you know, informing people and using digital solutions to communicate with them, to signpost people, which would mean that we don't need to make physical investments. So there's a whole sort of basket, if you like, of non-construction solutions that we could really be bringing to the fore now, that I think are really relevant. And there's not there's not an obvious place for that in our current industry. Maybe it's new entrants. So that's the sort of the last piece in terms of my reflections on what it means for industry. Just a thought I wanted to leave you with. I was talking to a developer around this a few weeks ago, and they came up with a really interesting concept. They were saying they were having to now look at their developments as if the officers would need to advertise themselves to people to encourage them to come and visit. And I just think that's a really interesting idea, is actually how do you take your sort of your asset base and you know, even just sort of setting aside all of the sort of physical changes you may need to make to it, think about actually, you know, almost how is that building going to communicate with people? How is it going to advertise itself? How is it going to interact with the people? And I certainly don't think that's a lens that we put into much of our sort of investment appraisal, investment decision making as it stands. So just to sort of finish on that thought, and I don't know quite whose role that's going to be, but it will certainly be an interesting one. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks very much indeed, Hannah. A lot of stuff you covered there, a lot of stuff, particularly, again, sort of continuing that theme that others have mentioned about flexibility and being comfortable with uncertainty. The fact that government may have to try out stuff in the future without knowing whether it's going to work or not. Obviously, they will be well advised, but even the best advice in the world won't necessarily mean that they'll get it right. And your plea to unravel complexity and simplify things for government, simplifying things for politicians, there's a thing that we can all dwell on. And also, I think as well interesting, you mentioned the potential opportunities that could arise going forward, particularly for SMEs. If we're talking about that, we're going to see much more, you know, retrofitting, sorting out what we've already got. Less, you know, mega projects being built in the short to medium term. So, you know, we could actually see, you know, a real, you know, sort of boost to that sector of the industry as well. So, you know, all interesting stuff there. And also as well, what you said as well about drawing on deeper insights from data, which I think is very much something that we have not touched on yet, but I'm sure we're about to, because our next speaker, by way of coincidence, is Jeff Mcgrath. And Jeff is the managing director at CK Delta, who are a data innovation company, and they're a member of one of the largest conglomerates in the world, CK Hutchinson Holdings. And CK Delta design and lab test bespoke data models for business. So I think they will definitely have a role to play as we move forward. And they are very much involved in understanding not only what is happening now, but also to predict what is actually coming in the future, which, I'm definitely all ears on as far as that's concerned. In a previous life, Jeff was also the chief innovation officer at McLaren. So he's no stranger to working in a cutting edge, innovative environment. So no pressure, Jeff, after that build up. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you, Andy. Good morning, everybody. So yes, to answer the question about the future of cities, I'm going to try and bring a different perspective, one of a practitioner that is very active as a contributor and a participant in urban life. So CK Delta's mission is to deliver long-term strategic value through innovative applications that leverage data assets from across the group. And we measure the value in three ways. The first way is, can we intelligently generate data in our business that we can use to develop models that we apply to make our businesses run better? So we get our instant ROI by making our businesses more future-proof, more resilient. And that's been tested out in an extreme way this year, and I'll share some of those learnings. Next, we package that up and see, can that be applied to businesses outside of the conglomerate? Of course it can. The use cases we see, the challenges we're all discussing this morning, we see around the world, because we're not limited to the UK or London. We work in truly globally. The third way is there's value in the very data that we capture if we innovate with it. So if data is the new oil, it has a value when it's embedded in business. It has a far higher value when we brought it to the surface, i.e. we've shared it. It has exponentially more value when we can combine it, maybe across those sectors in urban life. And then we refine it so that the innovators and the entrepreneurs out there can actually reduce the complexity and deliver an application that a non-technical person can understand and ingest. So that is the next frontier for me. So I look at CK Delta as a living laboratory, because our sister company, our holding company, is the world's largest health and beauty retailer. In this country owns Green King. So we are into the retail business. We do run gas, water, electricity, utilities. We do transport and logistics. We own 50 odd ports around the world. And we also have the glue that brings these sectors together, which is telecoms, the digital communication between people and machines, which is also a really vitally important facet of the future of cities. I think there's two elements here, that if we're trying to design a future, I think we should start not with system thinking, but with design thinking. Now, design thinking puts the human first. Then I think you do model the whole system for maximum impact. But to make that practical, you need to then embed yourself into the system and see how the human operators use that information and make it actionable intelligence and understand how an intervention translates to a tangible outcome. For that, you definitely need to be able to measure what you want to manage. This is where smart infrastructure comes in, understanding what insights would be valuable to respond to a perturbation in the system, like COVID. Having predictive analytics, so not just measuring what happened last week or last month, but actually reacting on the fly, processing at the point of measurement, so you don't clog up the network, and then running real-time simulations within the decision cycle, so you can run what-if scenarios. What should I do based on what I'm just now seeing? And actually, very weak signals can lead to very significant foresight, and actually you can preempt a lot of damage, a lot of collateral costs through retrospective action. And if you pull this all together, what you see is we get a better capability for planning for the future than operating that future state. So most people found last year really volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. All of us had stressful lives, probably overloaded with data. But actually, by building in the need for data and the modeling and simulation into the infrastructure, into the urban world itself, you actually can relieve a lot of that stress. So I think we'll move from decision support capabilities to cognitive enhancement so that people start performing better than their innate intelligence, because we've got this accelerated adoption of artificial intelligence that's been triggered by this COVID crisis. It became absolutely necessary to respond. Then also we'll accelerate automation and autonomy so that we can focus on the complex judgment calls and let the computers make some of the basic response calls. So I think the living environment will need to be much more interconnected and intrinsically intelligent. At the moment, I see that in pockets, but not in a whole system way. So I'm going to come back to that. That's not a pipe dream. I think it should be a design outlet. So 3 areas where we're active that I think I could share some experience. In mobility, we're seeing massive shift in the way populations move. Looking at live data over the last 2 years, it's very different to how people adapted to different modes of transport pre and post lockdown. There was no return to the mass transit systems. People didn't embrace trains, they drove everywhere, which is bad for the environment, actually. The patterns of movement were very different. People did stay far more local and made far more frequent trips. The bounce back was very different in Birmingham compared to London. City centre London, frankly, didn't recover. Places like Birmingham recovered extremely well, almost immediately after the lifting of lockdown. You can see that in the footfall on the streets. You can see that in a very different way, the macro movement to the micro movement, the catchment area to the bull ring. It's very different pre and post lockdown. We see the same in London. You can pick a destination shopping centre and people came not from far and wide post lockdown. Very different class of people were shopping, very different patterns of behaviour. So I don't know entirely what the answer to the question is. Is it different people are now moving about for different reasons? Or is it the same people who has different behavior? Because there's clearly a hysteresis. Life before and life after isn't the same. It doesn't spell the end of cities at all, but it does mean we need to understand that behavioral shift. Well, what's triggered it? And why is it a different sort of person shopping and maybe a different motivation to be on that street? We saw some strange patterns, actually. International travel actually came to a dead stop, but it was more than compensated in cities like Bath by domestic tourism. So that city had to be extremely resilient and adaptive to the way people's spending patterns changed and the motivations for the trips. And I'll end on a note about transport, back to mobility, because I actually think mobility, retail, tourism, and the impact on utilities, they're all one of the same thing. And if you can see the whole picture, you can optimize the city. So one of the greatest challenges now is the pace at which people are adopting electric vehicles triggers a huge challenge for putting charging points in the network. And also it has a huge challenge for the network itself that provides the electricity. And we really do need to come back to the design principle, put the human first and design around their needs while taking into account all the contributors to urban life. And that's, I think, is extremely hard to get right. And I don't pretend to have the answer, but what I can say is the data's telling us the story. We're just not quite sure what that means. So if we look at the early signals now, we'll get a glimpse of what the future state might be. And I think cities will be with us for a long time.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeff, for that, and particularly your comments on the need for more interconnectivity, which is obviously going to be, I'm sure, a leitmotif for the future shape of all cities as we move forward. Also interestingly, you talk about no return to mass transport. It'll be interesting to see how and if that actually persists as we move forward as well. And also, I wondered when we were going to get a mention from any the panelists about different modes of transport as well. I mean, we do have a future of transport webinar, gratuitous plug alert, later in the year. But this whole question of electric vehicles in particular, and one of the things that strikes me, if my inbox is anything to go by, is the number of press releases I'm receiving at the minute from electric scooter companies who seem to be signing deals up left, right, and centre with towns and cities all over the United Kingdom. So that whole concept of sort of greener transport going forward, be interesting to see whether or not we see some definitive and definite and permanent change in that area going forward as well. Anyway, a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. And a lot of agreement as well in the chat in terms of the stuff that you spoke about in relation to real-time data and its importance as well. Right, our final speaker, and just before I mention or introduce our final speaker, just to let people know that Julia Thompson may have to leave early. So if she disappears, it's because she's got another meeting that she has to be in shortly afternoon. So we'll say our goodbyes to Julia now anyway, if she does have to disappear. So just in case you were wondering if she does disappear. Our final speaker is the Director of Infrastructure and Energy at the communications organisation BECG, Jamie Gordon, who has his job title infers, does lead BECG's work in the infrastructure and energy sectors. And Jamie is no stranger to infrastructure intelligence live events and has waxed lyrical on a number of issues in this parish in the past. And I'm particularly looking forward to hearing his insights on this particular issue. BECG work with many organisations who are involved in the built and natural environment, engineers, contractors, clients, political organisations as well. So I'm sure that Jamie, with his insights based on 25 years of experience of delivering communications programs in our sector, will have something positive and interesting to say on this very important topic. Jamie, over to you.
Thanks for that, Andy. Yeah, well, although I live in London, I do promise I will mention some other cities. But I have to be honest, for today's purposes, I've made hopefully the fairly safe assumption that we're using population density rather than the presence of a cathedral as the classification for a city. So sorry to anyone from St David's. That's all I can say before I start. And because it is that population density that really makes a city, they're able to provide connectivity, employment, services that people really want, and the convenience around that. They're where the latest things happen, fashions develop, trends, and they're the hotbeds for university, collaboration, R&D. If you take a city like Cambridge, obviously a university town, but because of that collaboration between academia and industry is there, being a city, it's actually got 4 times more patents per capita than anywhere else in the country. And as we've seen recently with vaccine development, the Oxford Zeneca is a prime example. It's that collaboration, the cooperation between R&D is crucial, and that really works well with the proximity levels which only really a city can provide. So while there's no doubt things like retail, we're going to take a knock. There's going to be a massive behavioural change post-COVID. People have been shopping online for a long time now, and they'll continue to. Other industries, particularly the hospitality industries, they will bounce back very quickly, and they really are the heartbeat of cities. London's theatreland, yes, but you've also got Newcastle's big market and areas within cities that are very well known for particular hospitality sectors. But obviously some of that will depend on people working in the city. But I can't see en masse us all stopping going into work. I've been working from home now for 6 months. It's driven me and my family mad, I think. And if you look at the stats, surprisingly, 65% of people have been going into an office at some point during the outbreak. We like to travel into our place of work. And maybe those families who have a longer commute, they might drop down to 2 or 3 days a week. There's a possibility there. So there'll be a knock-on to certain hospitality footfalls. the lunchtime sandwich bar might see a bit of a knock, but equally the lunchtime sandwich bar where they live will probably pick up that business. So we are going to see a massive switch, and the young will always socialise. They'll always go out after work, and that's really the core audience for most city hospitalities. Office occupancy, we've spoken about this, may well drop off. Work share, hot desking will come into play, and I think with some agreement that the main office owners will have to change their formats to make it more attractive for tenants, and also from the tenants themselves, more attractive for their employers to come in. So we're probably talking more green space, more shared areas, generally a more attractive place to work. But also I think mixed usage, which was being touched upon by a number of people, will really kick in. And that change to accommodation, probably targeting mainly at young professionals, which is good because it has a lower knock-on effect to the required infrastructure, hospitals and schools. But also it will get young people on the property ladder quicker. I used to live in Warsaw, and most of the big tower blocks there were mixed usage. And I lived in one that was about 50-50 resi and office. And it's brilliant because you didn't have that huge rush for lifts in the morning. Half the people coming out, half the people going in. And it works really well. What we'll probably see is the main knock-on happening that some of the younger families in the suburbs spending more time there. Maybe the Waltham Little Holland model, where you do get these hubs and the 5-minute neighbourhoods that Steve was alluding to will pop up. But the main thing that cities have as a trump card, I think, has to be climate change. They're the quickest win towards net zero. The tight confines of the city mean that distributing clean energy solutions, collecting waste efficiently, economically viable public transport systems are all a viable option. And this is becoming more entwined now as well with green initiatives. We've seen EV trucks, refuse trucks, powered by energy from waste facilities, some of those with carbon capture on. There's a fantastic trial in Hannah's town of Sheffield on that at the moment. And this is all economically viable in a city environment, but quite challenging in a rural setting. And because the energy networks are much tighter in a city, other possibilities become available. We're seeing carbon clusters coming out now, HyNet in the northwest, zero carbon Humber in the northeast. And this is only really viable because the big energy users and carbon emitters are clustered around the cities. So piping in hydrogen and piping out the carbon is a viable option because of the critical mass. Again, that's very tricky in a rural community. And cities all tend to be on the gas grid as well. So that's a really quick win with a hydrogen injection solution. Vast majority of very rural environments aren't on the gas grid, so they're using a fossil fuel solution for domestic heating and cooking. And decarbonising that is extremely expensive. Ground heat source pumps aren't cheap. I've got one here, and they're pretty expensive to put in. And they do use a considerable amount of electricity, which puts strain on that rural electricity grid, which is something Jeff actually mentioned. The energy grid and the balancing of mass demand, which is going to change hugely with EVs and domestic heating moving more towards an electrical solution, will be very challenging. And again, their city has the edge. They have more data. It's easier to affect behavioural change and usage. You've got high amounts of inherent energy storage, for instance. A stat I love is that all the freezers in Tesco stores actually hold about 50 megawatts of energy in them. And that's enough for 35,000 homes. So just by switching those on and off, you're able to balance the system. That's something a smart city can do. I've heard the term smart city a lot. I haven't heard the term that much smart countryside. And it's the proximity and connectivity of cities that allow them to have the ability to balance the network possible. And that's before we start talking about platooning automated vehicles, waste heat from transport networks, all things that the city can implement quite simply and help towards that net zero agenda. Now, I'm not saying the countryside won't be able to do anything. Direct wire, microgrids, and solar is an easier implementation in the countryside, perhaps with community ownership. But it is going to be low-hanging fruit from the city that really helps politically the UK hitting that net zero target. And other political elements, I mean, the levelling up agenda, that doesn't really work without the cities. It's impossible to implement. So admittedly, cities have taken a knock, but they have a history of bouncing back. No city was lost to the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, obviously. And more recently, let's not forget Liverpool, which as recently as the 70s was listed by the government as selected for managed decline. Not a particularly nice term. Fortunately, obviously, they changed their minds, and in 2020, just before COVID, Liverpool actually, their employment rate was higher than the national average. So cities can bounce back from everything. So in my view, there's a bright future. They have the ability to address some of the big ticket political items in a quicker way. And because of that, they will still be driven. What we need is some legislative change, probably around planning, to make mixed usage more of a viable option. And when that comes into play, I think the cities will continue, and they'll continue to be the centre of industries like hospitality, be vibrant, youthful centres that everyone enjoys visiting and working. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Jamie. And interesting to hear you basically put the responsibility in some ways on obviously government, because obviously they're going to have to take some strategic decisions going forward. I think what will be interesting as well is how the government is influenced, going back to the points that Hannah was making earlier on, whether it be by using data, whether it be by cutting through all the confusion and everything else and presenting simple solutions to government and say, look, do this, we think it'll work, but it's got to be worth a try. But, you know, basically get on and do it, rather than say, well, you could think about this, you could think about that. So sort of first question for everybody, really, and I'll kick it off with Stephen. Spoke first, but partly because I like his wall, and that is basically how does the industry, how does our sector basically influence government in order to get it to be maybe a little bit more imaginative about some of the solutions that everybody's spoken about today? What would you do?
Crikey, that's a tough question. I must say that there's a smorgasbord of questions there in the chat. It's fascinating, really, really interesting. And I think what's really interesting at this point is how engaged everybody is in trying to deal with the opportunity that we can see in front of us. With regards to influencing government policy and politicians, I think when we are involved in trying to bring forward ambitious change in different places, I think the role of public engagement is really, really, really increasingly important, quite rightly. And it's now where we've advocated and promoted an idea to the officers and the seniors within those directorates within the local authority and the politicians that then sit behind them and make those decisions. What we're actually needing to do is making sure that we're reaching out and embracing the people and the communities in which these changes take place. So to give an example, we've been working in Glasgow, to mention a city other than London. We've been working in Glasgow on the Avenues programme there for the last 3 years. And that's a pretty transformative programme of urban infrastructure investment that fundamentally shifts the balance of the streets away from private vehicles across to walking, cycling, social spaces, but also the incorporation of green and blue infrastructure, taking all of the surface water and discharging it into the Clyde eventually. And what was interesting there is, having gone on that journey with the stakeholders of the city, what it boils down to is the political capital of the politicians and how we, as the advocates for this change, need to make sure that we treat that with the responsibility it deserves and engage with the constituency that determines their future in politics. I don't mean that in a sort of contrived way. I mean that in a very genuine way. We've got to bring those people on the journey with us and explain to them why these changes are to their community's advantage and what benefits it brings to them in their everyday lives.
Thanks, Stephen. If just turn to Hannah on that as well, you know, How are you seeing the industry being able to influence government around some of these issues? Are the government listening? Are they receptive to do things differently?
Well, they're definitely receptive at the moment. If anything, we've seen, one of the shifts with the pandemic has been that the government has become increasingly receptive because it doesn't have the bandwidth to do all of the thinking for all of the problems it's got or is trying to grapple with. Therein lies the rise of the Construction Leadership Council, which for the sort of more acute phases of COVID was acting as a pseudo government department. They wrote all of the safe site operating procedures, all of the things that you would perhaps think ordinarily would happen in government. They've had to lean slightly wider. So I think that will continue because, as I say, we're going to come out of the health crisis, but even then, the many plates you've got spinning, trying to balance off the tax system against the government's balance sheet, against the fact that people will be having very different sort of expectations, and society will have this kind of social recovery. That's a hell of a lot for any government to manage. So I think they're going to continue to be receptive. It sort of builds on Stephen's point, really. When you're in government making policy, I liken it to playing Jenga, because you sort of spend a while looking around to try to find the right brick to pull out and put back on the top of the tower. But until you do it, you don't really know, because you're working, you're sort of tweaking something on a system, and then you sort of think how it might respond, but you don't really know. And certainly because we're going to have this increasing question mark over people and how people's behaviour is going to settle down after COVID, that the Jenga tower just got a lot larger for government. So I think really what we need to be doing is trying to build confidence with government in terms of the industry's capability to develop and deliver the right solutions, but also in terms of the kind of the depth of analysis that we go into. I think it's too easy for us to sort of roll out the same old solutions. I thought some of what Jeff was saying in terms of the opportunities with the sorts of insights that we can develop, you pair that with some of our deep engineering knowledge, you've got some really fantastic things that there's no way government could do in-house. So why wouldn't they listen to us? And I think that's what we need to develop now. We need to really become the sort of trusted partner that has those deep insights because of the breadth and the connections across the industry.
Thanks, Hannah. Interesting Jenga analogy. As a child of the 60s, obviously I'm a Kaplunk man myself, but anyway, I think the principle is probably the same. And just on that interconnected sort of, when you do one thing, it has an effect on the other. Interesting question in the chat about the whole levelling up agenda. How does that dovetail with the strategy of the growth of cities over the next maybe 10, 20 years? I put that question to Andrew Jones from AECOM, because he mentioned something about levelling up. What's your observations on that? Can we do both? You're on mute, Andrew.
It was such a 2020 thing, wasn't it, being on mute? Yes, we have to. I think that some of the issues in our cities is around inequality. I touched on some of the pressures of overheating, particularly that affect city centres, some of the successful city centres across the country, but some of the outer suburbs and metropolitan towns are very different. In Greater Manchester, there's a stark difference between the city centre in Manchester and then when you get to Bury and Oldham and Rochdale, that they have absolutely polar challenges in many ways. So actually, it has to go hand in hand. I think there's another, going back to your former question as well, that around getting government engagement in this. So I think there are a number of things there around the levelling up is something that the government has had as a major manifesto pledge. It's also part of securing a next election win in 2024. So actually, yes, this is going to be part of and if we want to get government engaged, they're very open to ideas, as Hannah said, and actually if it plays to their agenda, then I think that the industry is well placed to have a great impact in that. So, and I think that levelling up then piece comes to does come to remaking remaking town centres, rethinking around what our places are going to be that we call home. I don't mean the houses we live in, but the communities that we live in. and whether that is a mayoral priority or a national government priority. I think that actually they're the places we're going to have to put our energies in.
Thanks, Andrew. Jeff, just some of your observations on that. You talked about using data to influence the actions of government. What about when maybe some of that data doesn't actually tell them what they want to hear? How do we get over that situation?
Okay, so maybe 2 points. One, I think it's unfair to show up to government with a pile of data or even a bunch of business intelligence, because I don't think under pressure anybody can digest that much information. I think that was part of the problem with the response to COVID. Too many data sets, too many facts, and not enough forward thinking. So I think the challenge is incumbent on us to produce visualizations that are intuitive and moreover interactive. So what if I do this? What will be the effect in a month's time or 2 months' time? Now, we did that to understand the effect on intensive care units. We're doing that now to understand how interventions might translate to hotel occupancy in the future. Can I foresee when travel will recover, and therefore I can expect some tourism in this part of the country? So that's one element. I think also leveling up, I think the politicians refer to it more from one city to the next or north to south. I think COVID affected populations in big cities in a very unequal way. And I think we're now seeing pockets of economic decline, which are very localized. They need to be leveled up too. It's not enough to say, let's say in London, to service the West End and make them bounce back while ignoring Tower Hamlets, which was probably hit harder than anywhere else in London. So the same goes for Liverpool versus Birkenhead, probably, which is where I grew up, by the way. I'm a tunnel rat. So Birkenhead is probably far harder hit than Liverpool. So I think there's a degree of local leveling up because certain people in certain types of jobs were having to travel, therefore they were more exposed and probably suffering economically worse. And that affects the local economy. And that's where we've tried to help governments see where to invest for recovery, because it's not obvious pre and post COVID.
Thanks very much for that. There's a number of sort of questions around a theme, and notwithstanding the fact that we do have an event coming up later in the year on transport, I think it would be remiss if we didn't actually at least in passing touch on the challenges in relation to transport. There's an interesting one, from the perspective of without mass commuting, if we don't go back to that to the extent that we used to have it, how can transport as we know it in cities actually continue? How can it survive? We've already seen that the sector's been massively hit and the government's had to pump, inordinate amounts of money in to actually save it. But how will that work going forward? Jamie, do you have a view on that?
I think obviously in some of the major cities, commuting will just become a more pleasant environment. I mean, if you get on the Northern Line in rush hour, it's hideous. It's so overcrowded. And in some ways, I think it will hit a natural balance with people working from home and finding commuting less of a suffering experience and still doing it. I think one of the big challenges, though, we're going to find is where a drop in regularity is required. There may be some challenges around that, and it's a difficult one to admit to, but you have to involve the trade unions in that discussion because it could well cause some job losses, and that's always a big challenge within the transport sector, how that is managed, and historically it's been a tricky one. I think regularity of services will probably drop off on some of the longer commutes. What you may find, though, is a far more technical-led solution where you have autonomous metro systems, as they're looking at doing in Cambridge. And I mentioned briefly platooning as a solution, and a lot more traffic modelling. I think the challenge we've probably got at the moment, we're in this period where we're not quite sure what it's going to look like, though. The whole future of transport is a tricky one to predict. And so that means that the traffic modelers, whatever they're going to model now for the next few years, is going to be difficult to actually say with any robust certainty that that's definitely going to be the required usage. Which, if you're putting something in the public realm as a plan at the moment, means it's pretty tricky when it comes to the consultation to actually stand up and wave the flag and say, yes, this is going to be totally justified. So I think that's a big challenge we've got on the traffic modelling side, to get some of these projects that are on the table through now because of that data question. There will be regularity changes on long haul commutes, but I think in the internal city structure, the technological advancements, I think you'll just see better transport, which is far more economically viable because of technologies like that too.
Thanks, Jamie. Another thing that's just crossed my mind is, you know, I think the panel's kind of agreed that we won't go back absolutely to what we had before. And I suppose around that, it raises in my mind the potential opportunities for maybe not just cities, but also some of the towns and villages that are out there. Many of whom have seen a renaissance during the course of the pandemic. I don't know whether you, Andrew, have got any sort of observations on that, what it could mean for maybe some of those areas that have been potentially ignored in the past, but now might look, you know, increasingly attractive for people. You're muted again. Oh, you're still muted.
Right, I was taking your instruction and being on mute when we weren't talking. I think there's a number of dimensions to that. Firstly, and I don't, and this is there's a thought here that actually, if we're in a situation where we are no longer absolutely tied to economic progress being based upon proximity, some of those economic drivers can be through digital connection. So places that had lost their economic rationale because of heavy industry moving or reliance on natural resources can actually benefit from an economic growth based upon a digital future. So does that provide a different background to some of the Lancashire towns or some of the coastal towns that have been really struggling, that actually have great quality of life, that have great natural resources, natural environments, that are places that people want to move to if they don't have to commute to the big city 5 days a week, or if they want to set up a business locally that doesn't rely on them being absolutely tied to a city centre location or to an airport. So there's one area there. I think that the other component is that as larger occupiers are looking to perhaps downsize in city centre locations, they see the benefits of lower cost suburban or town centre locations to have major office spaces. That actually we may see the renaissance in some of the commercial markets in towns that are in city regions rather than, and more broadly out, rather than just the CBDs of cities. And I think that aligned with some of the patterns of people people moving out of, and as Julia was talking about, some people moving out of London over the pandemic period, while particularly if they have families or that they want to get better value for money for their for the floor space that they have, that actually the dynamic of our cities and city regions can change. So those smaller towns, going back to your point, the smaller towns may well have a strong future, but that will depend on how well they're connected both digitally and physically to some of the bigger cities. So there's a different balance coming out here.
Thanks for that. I think you're right to raise the importance of digital connectivity, because I think on the whole, while it's probably held up reasonably well, we wouldn't have been able to do what we've all done over the course of the last 10, 11 months. Clearly, there are some challenges in other areas, not the least of which might be in some of those, especially coastal areas, that potentially could be ripe for a renaissance going forward. And I'm sure if we had a representative of the British Tourist Board, although they're probably not called that anymore, you know, they would be bigging up the opportunities for coastal visits this summer, because it looks like still not many of us are going to be going, going abroad. But I think that digital connectivity is absolutely vital. I think in all cases, and I'm sure in all of our areas, while it might be okay in the main city centres, there'll be areas on the outskirts and certainly in the countryside that won't be that far away from all of us that will be challenged from that. And I think it's a big challenge going forward to getting that sorted out, isn't it?
Places like Cumbria and Cornwall have been pushing so hard for a decade or more on getting exceptional broadband into places where it isn't commercially viable for BT Openreach to just go in and deliver it. And actually, that's going to expand because actually, perhaps local authorities should be they already are refocusing their thoughts on getting excellent digital connectivity into places rather than necessarily arguing for a new rail or a better rail service into the nearest city. Because going back to Hannah, your point earlier, that we aren't going to be doing these big projects or new big projects coming out, but actually getting behind the digital revolution may be something that is something that meets government agendas as well as the needs of individual places.
As ever, we've run out of time, which is inevitable in an issue like this. But I do have one final, as I always do, killer question, and hopefully our panelists can answer it briefly. And it was put in the chat quite early on, but I think it's a really good one to finish off with. And it's from Sue James, and she asks: is there one single thing that each panelist would see as something that would make a significant change to improve the future city? And you can answer that however you want, as long as you do it briefly. And I'll start off first of all with Jeff.
Okay, so I would say pervasive 5G comms will make the Internet of Things a reality. Then artificial intelligence will make our performance higher. So ubiquitous communications and high speed.
Thanks for that. Jamie, who's on mute?
Sorry. I'd go with Metro Mayors. I think Metro Mayors are a fantastic concept. You see some of the things they've been able to do. I mean, London, the Oyster card, the Boris Bikes, and initiatives like that. But you've got the streets, the Palmers of this world. They've all got ideas for the city, and they've all been given the power to do it. And it's the fact that you can look at something citywide rather than all the little districts all doing their own little piece. So I think politically, Metro Mayors, great idea.
Thanks for that, Jamie. Hannah, what's your one thing? I know there can't only be one, but for this question, there'll have to be.
No, it's fine. I'm going to go slightly controversially to what Jamie's just said. I think it's not. I think it's the ones below the Metro Mayors. I think it's those not quite towns and cities that are just below Metro Mayor level. I think they need to buddy up with each other rather than competing, and start to make the case and start to learn and understand together. Because they're all going to be grappling with the same problems, and they can't all have an innovation park or whatever's in the local industrial strategies at the moment. So get those guys together, whether that's something industry can convene. I think, opportunity there for the consultants, Andrew.
Thanks very much for that. Andrew, neatly queuing you in.
Yeah, all of the above from others, but I think affordable housing is the piece that I would add to the list, and a real lens on that. A lot of our, particularly the centre of cities, have been pretty inaccessible to people who are absolutely essential to running the city, but they are being faced with unaffordable housing and also very long commutes, either of which doesn't work. So affordable housing would be my add to that.
Thanks. And finally, Stephen, your view on that one.
Thanks, Andy. Sue James is a friend of mine. She's always asking these really challenging questions that are wrong foots panels. And it is really hard to settle down on one question. But I also know with Sue, who's a keen advocate of the Tree Design Action Group, that biodiversity and the embracing of natural nature-based solutions is going to be crucial. And we talked about the funding not being available for big bang infrastructure projects, but actually the government did release their paper last year about gear change and LTN 120 and put 2 billion behind it in terms of cycling infrastructure. And I think those types of projects, we need to see more of them, but we also need to see more ambition. One very final point, if I may, because actually there was in the chat, there was Andrew Elliott, who was castigating me a little bit for downing engineers for being part of the problem here. And I stand by what I said, because you've got things like Manual for Streets, which was introduced in 2007, and it's still a struggle for engineers to take that on as the standard by which we should start the conversation. So I take all of that and agree with all of the points about the data collection and our decisions being informed by data, but there's no escaping the excellence that we need to exercise as engineers in our judgment of how these things prevail to get better outcomes.
Thanks very much for that, Stephen. And another area that I was lobbied before the event to talk about, we just haven't had time to get round to it, and that is the value of underground space under our towns and cities as well, which I kind of had a disconnect with that, because obviously we've been dying to get out into the open air, and then someone said, oh, you've got to talk about going underground, which is obviously a cue for a 1980s song, which I won't mention. But anyway, Think Deep UK is the organisation, if you want to check out what they're doing in relation to underground space. But again, thanks very, very much indeed to all of the members of our panel for their insights today. It's been absolutely fascinating in terms of a subject. It's impossible, isn't it, to do justice to it in 90 minutes. But thanks very much indeed to Stephen, to Julia Thompson, who's obviously had to leave us, Andrew Jones, Hannah Vickers, Jeff Mcgrath, and Jamie Gordon from BCG. Thanks as well, as always, to BCG for their support for our Infrastructure Intelligence Live events. Going forward, we've got more events during the course of the spring and of the summer. We've got a significant social value and construction event coming up at the end of March, on the 26th of March, that I'd urge everybody to register for. Check out our website. All the links are there for our events. And I mentioned earlier on as well, we have the Future of Transport event coming up in May as well. And we also have an event very topical, given some of the comments in closing today's webinar about levelling up. We've got a good event on placemaking and levelling up going forward. I think it's clear that, notwithstanding the points that some people made, both in the chat and from the actual virtual sort of platform, if you like, that our industry has a massive role to play in this agenda going forward, and not just in terms of getting the work done, but also in influencing and advising and counselling governments and local governments to actually make the right decisions. And I think we shouldn't be backward in coming forward on those particular issues, because there's no question, given not just what people have said, our speakers today, but also the brilliant conversation and discussion in the chat, that we've got some fantastic ideas that we'd love to see as well. People sending into Infrastructure Intelligence, so that we can actually fly some of those particular, ideas, kites, call them what you want, and let's have that discussion. Let's, as Hannah said earlier, we'll have to try different things that might not work, but let's have a discussion and let's have that ideas factory, if you like, so that we can actually make progress in this important area going forward. Again, thanks very much to everyone for taking part, and thanks to the audience as well for making it a great event. And all that remains for me to say is have a great weekend. Thanks very much indeed.
That was great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andy, for good sharing.
Bye.
Bye.